Welcome and settle in as we journey together through the sands of time, back to an era when the world was young and civilization first began to flourish along the banks of mighty rivers. Tonight, we travel to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, where some of humanity's earliest and most profound stories were first written in wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay tablets. This is a story about gods, about power, about creation itself, and about how ancient beliefs have echoed through millennia to capture our imagination even today. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the fertile plains of what is now Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow like life-giving veins through an otherwise harsh landscape. Here, in this cradle of civilization, the Sumerians built their cities of mud brick and reed, towering ziggurats reaching toward the heavens, and temples where priests performed rituals to appease beings they believed controlled every aspect of their existence. These beings had many names, but among the most powerful and mysterious were those known as the Anunnaki. The very sound of the word carries weight, doesn't it? Anunnaki. It rolls off the tongue with an air of ancient authority, of secrets buried beneath desert sands for thousands of years. But who were they, really? Were they gods in the traditional sense, divine beings worthy of worship and sacrifice? Were they, as some modern theorists claim, visitors from distant stars who shaped humanity's destiny? Or were they something else entirely? Metaphors and myths created by a people trying to make sense of a world they could barely comprehend? Tonight, we'll explore all of these questions and more. We'll walk through the actual historical evidence, examining what the ancient Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians actually wrote about these mysterious Anunnaki. We'll delve into epic poems that have survived for 4,000 years, creation myths that predate the Bible, and flood stories that may have inspired the tale of Noah's Ark. We'll meet individual gods like Enlil, the lord of wind and storms, and Enki, the wise god of fresh waters and wisdom. We'll discover how these deities were said to have shaped the cosmos, decided the fates of mortals, and even created humanity itself. But our journey doesn't end with ancient texts. We'll also explore how these ancient stories captured the imagination of a modern author named Zecharia Sitchin, who in the 1970s proposed a radical reinterpretation that would spawn an entire industry of ancient astronaut theories. We'll examine his claims carefully, looking at both what made them so appealing and why scholars of ancient languages have thoroughly rejected them. We'll separate the fascinating historical truth from creative modern fiction, giving you the tools to understand both what we actually know about the Anunnaki and why they continue to fascinate us. The birth of civilization in Mesopotamia. To understand the Anunnaki, we must first understand the world in which they were born, not as actual beings, but as concepts, as stories, as the framework through which an entire civilization understood reality itself. Let us travel back nearly 6,000 years to a time when writing itself was being invented, when the very concept of cities was new and revolutionary. Mesopotamia, that name means the land between rivers in ancient Greek. But to the people who lived there, it was simply home, the only world they knew. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers created a narrow strip of extraordinarily fertile land, cutting through an otherwise inhospitable desert region. When these rivers flooded, they deposited rich silt across the plains, creating soil so productive that agriculture could support dense populations. This agricultural surplus was the foundation upon which the world's first true urban civilization arose. The Sumerians emerged in southern Mesopotamia, in the region that would later be called Sumer, around 3,500 years before the Common Era. We still don't know where they came from. Their language, Sumerian, is what linguists call an isolate, meaning it has no known relationship to any other language family. It's as if they appeared fully formed, with a sophisticated culture, advanced technology for their time, and most remarkably, with writing. Imagine being among the first people in human history to scratch symbols into clay, and have those symbols convey meaning to someone else who might read them days, months, or even years later. This was revolutionary. Writing transformed human society in ways that are difficult for us to fully comprehend, living as we do in an age where written communication is ubiquitous. Before writing, all knowledge had to be passed down orally, from one generation to the next, with all the limitations and distortions that entailed. With writing, knowledge could be preserved precisely. Laws could be codified, contracts could be enforced, and complex bureaucracies could manage increasingly large and sophisticated societies. The Sumerians didn't stop at writing. They developed the wheel, which revolutionized transportation and pottery making. They created the first schools where young scribes learned to read and write cuneiform. They built massive irrigation systems that required sophisticated engineering and social organization. They developed mathematics, using a base 60 counting system that we still use today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. They studied the stars with remarkable precision, tracking the movements of planets and creating some of the earliest astronomical records. They brewed beer, one of humanity's oldest alcoholic beverages, and considered it so important that they had a goddess dedicated to it. Their cities were marvels of urban planning for their time. Places like Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash grew to populations of tens of thousands, enormous by the standards of that era. At the heart of each city stood a ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid made of mud brick, serving as both a temple and a symbolic mountain linking Earth to the heavens. These ziggurats could be seen for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plains, dominating the skyline and serving as a constant reminder of the power of the gods and the priests who served them. The Sumerian worldview was deeply religious, not in the way we might think of religion today as something separate from daily life, but as an all-encompassing explanation for every aspect of existence. The gods weren't distant, abstract concepts. They were active participants in the world, beings with personalities, desires, conflicts, and needs. Every aspect of nature, every force that affected human life was controlled by divine beings. The storm that could destroy crops or the flood that could wipe out villages, these weren't random natural phenomena, but the actions of specific gods pursuing their own agendas. And at the top of this divine hierarchy, along with gods like An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess, were the Anunnaki. But who exactly were they? To answer that question, we need to look at what the ancient texts themselves actually say. Understanding the Anunnaki in ancient texts. The word Anunnaki appears in ancient Sumerian texts and later in Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian writings. Understanding its meaning is crucial to understanding who these beings were supposed to be. The term is typically composed of several elements in Sumerian. An refers to heaven or the sky and is also the name of the supreme sky god. Ki means earth. The suffix aki or anaki has been interpreted to mean offspring or seed. So the most widely accepted scholarly translation of Anunnaki is something like offspring of An and Ki, princely seed, or those of royal blood. This is important because it immediately tells us that in Sumerian cosmology, the Anunnaki weren't some separate species or alien race. They were divine beings, children of the primordial couple of heaven and earth, representing the highest tier of gods in the pantheon. They were, quite literally, the divine princes, the royal family of the cosmos. In the earliest Sumerian texts, from around 2,600 years before the Common Era, the term Anunnaki seems to have referred to the most powerful and important gods collectively. These were the beings who held authority over the forces that shaped existence. They weren't a fixed number of specific gods, but rather a collective term for the great deities who, in Sumerian belief, determined the fate of both gods and mortals. One of the earliest references to the Anunnaki appears in inscriptions from the reign of Gudea, a ruler of the Sumerian city-state of Lagash, around 2,100 years before the Common Era. In these texts, The Anunnaki are described as powerful deities associated with determining fates and maintaining cosmic order. They are portrayed as a council of great gods who made decisions affecting all of creation. As Mesopotamian civilization evolved and different peoples came to dominate the region, the understanding of the Anunnaki evolved as well. The Akkadians, a Semitic people who conquered Sumer and whose language eventually became the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, adopted Sumerian religion and literature but adapted it to their own purposes. Later, the Babylonians and Assyrians, who spoke dialects of Akkadian, continued this tradition, preserving Sumerian myths while also modifying them. In Babylonian literature, particularly in texts from the first millennium before the Common Era, we see a shift in how the Anunnaki are portrayed. They begin to be more closely associated with the underworld, the realm of the dead. In this later conception, the Anunnaki become judges of the dead, determining the fate of souls in the afterlife. This is a significant change from their earlier portrayal as heavenly gods governing the cosmos. The reason for this shift isn't entirely clear, but it may relate to the introduction of another group of divine beings called the Igigi. In some texts, the Igigi are portrayed as younger gods, who performed labor for the older Anunnaki gods. In other texts, the Igigi seem to be gods of heaven, while the Anunnaki are gods of earth or the underworld. The relationship between these two groups is complex and varies depending on which text you're reading and which time period it comes from. What's crucial to understand is that the Anunnaki weren't a single fixed concept. They evolved over more than 2,000 years of Mesopotamian religious thought, taking on different roles and characteristics as different cultures reinterpreted the myths they had inherited. This fluidity actually makes perfect sense when you consider that we're talking about a religious tradition that lasted longer than Christianity has existed so far. Despite these variations, certain core ideas about the Anunnaki remain consistent across most sources. They were always portrayed as powerful, as closely connected to An, the supreme sky god, and as beings who held authority over fundamental aspects of existence. They were judges, decision-makers, the high council of the divine realm. When the gods needed to make important decisions, when fates needed to be decided, when cosmic order needed to be maintained, it was the Anunnaki who convened to deliberate and decree. Let's look at some of the specific gods who were counted among the Anunnaki. Understanding these individual deities helps us grasp what the Anunnaki actually represented to the ancient Mesopotamians. An, also known as Anu in Akkadian, was the supreme god of the heavens. He was the father figure of the pantheon, the ultimate source of authority. Temples dedicated to An stood in cities across Mesopotamia, and his name was invoked in countless rituals and prayers. He embodied the concept of divine kingship and ultimate sovereignty. Enlil was another major Anunnaki deity, the god of wind, storms, and earth. In many texts, Enlil actually seems to be the most active and powerful god, more involved in the day-to-day running of the cosmos than the more distant An. Enlil was the one who could send devastating storms or blessed rains, who could ensure bountiful harvests or cause famine. He was feared and respected in equal measure, and the city of Nippur, where his main temple stood, was considered the religious center of Sumer. Enki, known as Ea in Akkadian, was the god of the subterranean sweet waters called the Abzu, as well as wisdom, crafts, and magic. Enki was portrayed as cleverer and more sympathetic to humanity than many of the other gods. Numerous myths depict him as humanity's protector and benefactor, often working behind the scenes to help mortals or to teach them useful skills. His main cult center was in the ancient city of Eridu, which some traditions held to be the first city ever created. Ninhursag, sometimes called Ninmah, was the great mother goddess associated with fertility, birth, and the nurturing of life. She was portrayed as one of the senior Anunnaki and played crucial roles in creation myths. In some texts, she is the one who shapes human beings from clay, giving them physical form. Inanna, known as Ishtar in Akkadian, was the goddess of love, beauty, sex, warfare, and political power. One of the most complex and fascinating figures in Mesopotamian mythology, Inanna was both nurturing and destructive, capable of great passion and terrible violence. Her mythology includes some of the most dramatic stories in the Mesopotamian corpus, including her descent into the underworld, a myth that would influence religious thought for millennia. Nanna, called Sin in Akkadian, was the moon god, one of the most important celestial deities. The moon's phases were crucial for the Mesopotamian calendar, so Nanna's importance in both religious and practical terms can't be overstated. He was the father of two other major Anunnaki, the sun god Utu Shamash in Akkadian, and the goddess Inanna. Utu, or Shamash, was the sun god and also the god of justice. The sun sees everything, so it made perfect sense to the Mesopotamians that the sun god would be the one who witnessed human actions and ensured justice was done. Many law codes, including the famous Code of Hammurabi, invoke Shamash as the divine source of legal authority. Marduk was originally a local god of the city of Babylon, but when Babylon rose to political dominance in Mesopotamia during the second millennium before the Common Era, Marduk's status rose correspondingly. By the time the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, was composed, Marduk had been elevated to the position of supreme god, credited with creating the ordered cosmos from primordial chaos. The Enuma Elish essentially rewrites earlier Sumerian myths to place Marduk at the center, reflecting Babylon's political power. These are just some of the major Anunnaki. Ancient sources mention many more, sometimes listing 50 great gods, sometimes speaking of 300 Anunnaki of heaven and 300 of earth, sometimes giving other numbers. The exact count and composition varied, but what remained constant was the idea that these were the great gods, the divine nobility, the beings who shaped the cosmos and determined the course of events. What's important to understand is that these weren't abstract philosophical concepts or allegorical figures representing natural forces, at least not in the way we might think of that today. To the ancient Mesopotamians, these gods were real as the king or the neighbor next door, just vastly more powerful and living in a different realm. People built massive temples to house them. Priests tended to statues of them daily, feeding and clothing the images as if they were living beings. Festivals were held in their honor, with elaborate processions, ritual meals, and dramatic reenactments of mythological events. The entire structure of society was organized around serving these gods, ensuring their needs were met and their favor was maintained. When we read ancient Mesopotamian literature, we're not just reading stories, we're reading the foundational texts out of a civilization's worldview, the lens through which they understood reality itself. The Anunnaki in ancient epic literature. Now that we understand who the Anunnaki were supposed to be, let's explore how they appear in the actual literature that has survived from ancient Mesopotamia. These aren't dry religious texts, but vivid, dramatic stories full of conflict, passion, and profound questions about existence, mortality, and the relationship between gods and humanity. Perhaps the most famous piece of Mesopotamian literature is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which many scholars consider to be the world's oldest surviving work of great literature. The story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, was first composed in Sumerian around 2,000 years before the Common Era, then later translated and expanded in Akkadian and Babylonian versions. The most complete version we have is from the library of Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian king who ruled in the 7th century before the Common Era, but it's based on much older source material. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a profound meditation on mortality, friendship, and what it means to be human. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, is initially portrayed as a tyrant, oppressing the people of Uruk. The gods respond to the people's complaints by creating Enkidu, a wild man who becomes Gilgamesh's companion and helps to civilize and calm him. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu have great adventures, defeating the monster Humbaba and slaying the Bull of Heaven. But then, tragedy strikes. The gods decide that Enkidu must die as punishment for these deeds. His death devastates Gilgamesh and sends him on a desperate quest for immortality. It's during this quest that Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the only human ever granted immortality by the gods. And it's here that we encounter the Anunnaki in one of the most dramatic scenes in all of ancient literature, the story of the Great Flood. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he came to be immortal. Long ago, when he was a king of the city of Shurupak, the great gods, including the Anunnaki, held a secret council. The god Enlil, disturbed by the noise and chaos of the growing human population, convinced the other gods to destroy humanity with a great flood. But Enki, ever sympathetic to mortals, cleverly warned Utnapishtim by speaking to the reed wall of his house, technically keeping his oath not to directly tell any human about the coming disaster. Enki instructed Utnapishtim to build a massive boat and to load it with his family, craftsmen and animals of every kind. When the flood came, it was devastating beyond imagination. The text describes it vividly. With the first light of dawn, a black cloud came from the horizon. It thundered within where Adad, lord of the storm, was riding. The gods of the abyss rose up. Nergal pulled out the dams of the nether waters. Ninurta, the warlord, threw down the dikes. And the 7 judges of hell, the Anunnaki, raised their torches, lighting the land with their livid flame. This is one of the key passages mentioning the Anunnaki in the Epic of Gilgamesh. They appear as the 7 judges of hell, wielding torches that light up the world with destructive flame. They are part of the cosmic forces, unleashing devastation upon humanity. The flood is so terrible that even the gods are terrified. They flee to the highest heaven, cowering like dogs against the outer walls. The goddess Ishtar wails, regretting that she agreed to the destruction of her people. For 6 days and 7 nights, the storm raged. When it finally subsided, all of humanity except Utnapishtim and those on his boat had been destroyed. His boat came to rest on a mountain, and after waiting, he sent out birds to test whether the waters had receded. First a dove, which returned, then a swallow, which also returned, and finally a raven, which did not come back, showing that dry land was now available. Utnapishtim offered a sacrifice on the mountain, and the gods, who had been without offering since the flood began and were apparently quite hungry, gathered around the sacrifice like flies. Ishtar arrived and swore by her jeweled necklace that she would remember these terrible days forever. She declared that all the gods could come to the sacrifice except Enlil, who had caused the flood without proper consideration. When Enlil did arrive and saw that some humans had survived, he was furious, but Enki spoke up, criticizing Enlil for his harsh judgment. Lay upon the sinner his sin, lay upon the transgressor his transgression, Enki argued. Punish him a little when he breaks loose. Do not drive him too hard, or he perishes. He suggested that instead of destroying all of humanity, Enlil could have sent smaller disasters, lions, wolves, famine, or pestilence. Enlil, accepting this wisdom, took Utnapishtim and his wife by the hand, touched their foreheads, and transformed them into immortal beings like the gods themselves. But he made clear that this was a unique, never-to-be-repeated event. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that there is no way for him to achieve the same immortality, that death is the inevitable fate of all mortals. This flood story in Gilgamesh is remarkably similar to the biblical story of Noah, and most scholars agree that the biblical account was influenced by the Mesopotamian tradition. But there are also significant differences. In the Mesopotamian version, the gods are conflicted, even fearful. They act impulsively and then regret their actions. The hero survives not because of his righteousness, but because one clever god found a loophole. And the Anunnaki appear not as benevolent creators, but as the fearsome judges wielding the torches of destruction. Another crucial text for understanding the Anunnaki is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. This text, written around the 12th century before the Common Era, tells the story of how the cosmos came into being and how order emerged from primordial chaos. The epic begins with a time before creation, when nothing existed except two primordial beings: Apsu, the god of fresh water, and Tiamat, the goddess of salt water in primordial chaos. Their waters mingled, and from them came younger generations of gods. These younger gods were noisy and disturbed Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu wanted to destroy them, but Tiamat was reluctant. However, Ea, one of the young gods, learned of Apsu's plan and killed him first. Tiamat then raised an army of monsters to avenge Apsu. The younger gods were terrified and didn't know how to fight her. Marduk, a young god and the son of Ea, stepped forward and offered to fight Tiamat on one condition. If he won, he would be made supreme king of the gods. The gods agreed, and Marduk defeated Tiamat in a terrible battle, splitting her body in two. From one half, he created the heavens, and from the other, the earth. He organized the cosmos, set the stars in their courses, and established order throughout creation. After his great victory, Marduk decided to create humanity. The rebel god Kingu, who had led Tiamat's army and held the tablets of destiny, was sacrificed. From Kingu's blood mixed with clay, the god Ea created human beings. And what was the purpose of humanity in this creation myth? We are told explicitly, humans were created to serve the gods, to do the work that the gods no longer wanted to do themselves, to provide them with offerings and maintain their temples. It's in the Enuma Elish that we get one of the most detailed descriptions of the Anunnaki's role. After humanity is created and begins to serve the gods, the grateful Anunnaki build a magnificent temple for Marduk in Babylon, the great ziggurat called Esagila. The text describes how 300 Anunnaki of heaven and 300 of the earth, a total of 600 Anunnaki, acknowledged Marduk as supreme and worked to build his dwelling. This is significant for several reasons. First, it clearly places the Anunnaki as subordinate to Marduk, reflecting Babylon's political supremacy and the elevation of its patron god. Second, it assigns them a specific number, 600, divided between heaven and earth. Third, it shows them in their role as a divine council, making important decisions and carrying out the will of the supreme deity. The Enuma Elish then proceeds to list 50 names or aspects of Marduk, each one defining a different aspect of his power and authority. The Anunnaki are present at this naming ceremony, acknowledging each name and confirming Marduk's supreme authority over all aspects of creation. It's a lengthy, almost ritualistic section of the text, but it serves to cement Marduk's position and, by extension, Babylon's religious and political authority over Mesopotamia. Another important text is the Atrahasis epic, an older Akkadian text from around the 17th century before the Common Era. This epic provides another version of the creation of humanity and the flood story with some interesting variations. In Atrahasis, we learn that originally the Anunnaki gods forced a group of lesser gods, called the Igigi, to do all the hard labor of maintaining the world, digging canals, maintaining irrigation systems, and other back-breaking work. After 40 years, the Igigi rebel. They burn their tools, surround the house of Enlil, and demand relief from their endless toil. The gods hold a council to decide what to do. It's Enki who comes up with a solution. Create a new species, humans, who can take over the labor from the Igigi. The goddess Belet Ili, with Enki's help, creates humans from clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain god. This divine element supposedly gives humans intelligence and a kind of kinship with the gods, even though we're also explicitly created as servants. Humans multiply and thrive, working the fields and maintaining the temples. But then we become too numerous and too noisy. The god Enlil, disturbed by the commotion, sends a series of disasters to reduce the human population: plague, drought, and famine. Each time, Enki secretly helps humanity to survive. Finally, Enlil decides on a flood to wipe out humanity entirely. Once again, Enki warns the hero Atrahasis, who builds an ark and survives. After the flood, the gods realize they need humans for the offerings and labor they provide. A compromise is reached. Humanity will continue to exist, but various measures will be introduced to control population growth, including infant mortality and women who cannot bear children. It's a rather grimmer view of the human condition than many creation myths, but it reflects the harsh realities of life in ancient Mesopotamia. What's striking about all these texts is how they portray the Anunnaki and the other gods. They aren't omnipotent, omniscient beings in the way that, say, the God of Abraham is conceived in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition. They have limitations. They experience emotions like fear, anger, and regret. They make mistakes. They argue among themselves and sometimes work at cross purposes. They depend on humanity for sustenance through offerings, which is why they regret destroying humanity and why they need to create us in the first place. Yet despite these very human-like characteristics, or perhaps because of them, these gods represented real power to the ancient Mesopotamians. They controlled the forces that determined whether crops would grow or wither, whether rain would fall or drought would strike, whether a king would triumph or be defeated, whether a child would be born healthy or sick. In a world without scientific understanding of natural phenomena, where disease, weather, and disaster struck without warning or apparent reason, having a framework of gods and their wills to explain these events was psychologically and socially crucial. The Anunnaki, as the highest tier of these gods, represented the ultimate authorities, the supreme court of the cosmos. When they gathered in council to decree fates, their decisions were final. They embodied the ancient Mesopotamian understanding of how the universe worked, not through impersonal natural laws, but through the wills and actions of powerful beings who had to be respected, appeased, and honored. Archaeological evidence and the science of cuneiform. Let's turn now from mythology to archaeology, from the stories themselves to the physical evidence of how we know about them. The rediscovery and decipherment of cuneiform writing is itself a fascinating story, one that revolutionized our understanding of ancient history. For nearly 2,000 years after the last cuneiform tablets were written, the entire civilization of ancient Mesopotamia was essentially forgotten. The cities of Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh were buried under sand and soil. The ziggurats crumbled into mysterious mounds. The countless clay tablets that recorded everything from epic poems to grocery lists, from royal decrees to school exercises, lay hidden underground, their secrets locked in a script that no living person could read. European travelers who visited the Middle East in the 17th and 18th centuries encountered strange ruins and mysterious inscriptions. At Persepolis, the ancient Persian capital, elaborate inscriptions covered the ruins in an unknown script made up of wedge-shaped marks. These inscriptions fascinated scholars, who called the script cuneiform from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge. The breakthrough in deciphering cuneiform came through a remarkable inscription at a place called Behistun in what is now Iran. There, carved into a cliff face, was a huge inscription commissioned by the Persian king Darius I around 500 years before the Common Era. Crucially, this inscription was written in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, all using cuneiform script. It was like finding the Rosetta Stone for cuneiform. A British officer named Henry Rawlinson, stationed in Persia in the 1830s and 40s, risked his life to copy the Behistun inscription, climbing the dangerous cliff face repeatedly over several years. His copies, combined with work by other scholars like Edward Hincks, Jules Aupert, and Georg Friedrich Grotefend, eventually allowed cuneiform to be deciphered. The process wasn't quick or easy. Old Persian cuneiform was relatively simple, with only 42 signs representing syllables and a few determinatives. Once scholars could read Old Persian, They could use the trilingual inscriptions to help decipher the much more complex Babylonian and Assyrian versions of cuneiform, which used hundreds of signs that could represent syllables, entire words, or semantic categories. By the 1850s and 60s, scholars could read Akkadian and Babylonian cuneiform with reasonable confidence. The decipherment of Sumerian took longer because Sumerian was completely unrelated to any known language, making it much harder to figure out. As cuneiform was being deciphered, an archaeological revolution was underway. Excavations in Mesopotamia, particularly at sites like Nineveh in northern Iraq, were uncovering vast libraries of clay tablets. The most spectacular find was the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, who ruled in the 7th century before the Common Era. Ashurbanipal was a learned king who collected texts from across his empire. His library contained thousands of tablets covering every aspect of Mesopotamian learning: literature, religion, history, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and magic. Among these tablets was the Epic of Gilgamesh. In 1872, a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith was working in the British Museum when he translated the tablet containing the flood story from Gilgamesh. The parallels with the biblical flood narrative were immediately obvious and caused a sensation. Here was evidence that the flood story in Genesis had earlier Mesopotamian versions, suggesting that biblical narratives might have been influenced by or borrowed from older sources. The discovery caused both excitement and controversy. For many Europeans and Americans in the 19th century, the Bible was considered the oldest book in the world and the literal Word of God. The idea that its stories might have earlier, pagan versions was challenging to traditional beliefs. But for scholars, it opened up an entirely new understanding of the ancient world and the development of religious thought. Since George Smith's time, hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets have been discovered. Estimates suggest that between 500,000 and 2 million cuneiform tablets have been excavated, though only a tiny fraction, perhaps 30 to 100,000, have been fully translated and published. This is partly because of the sheer volume of material and partly because there aren't enough specialists trained in reading cuneiform. These tablets weren't all epic poems and religious texts. The vast majority are actually quite mundane. Economic records, legal contracts, administrative documents, letters, school exercises, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, and the countless records of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. But even these mundane tablets are valuable because they give us insight into how Mesopotamian society actually functioned. The tablets were made from clay, one of the most abundant resources in Mesopotamia. A scribe would take a lump of wet clay, shape it into a rectangle or sometimes a pillow shape, and then use a stylus, typically made from a reed, to press wedge-shaped marks into the soft surface. The marks were made by pressing the stylus at different angles and depths. After the text was inscribed, the tablet would either be left to dry in the sun, or, for important documents, baked in a kiln. Sun-dried tablets were more fragile and could be easily recycled. If you made a mistake, you could just wet the clay and smooth it out to start over. Fired tablets were permanent, which is why documents that were meant to last, like royal inscriptions or temple archives, were typically fired. Ironically, many unfired tablets survived because they were inadvertently fired when buildings burned down, turning a disaster into a blessing for archaeologists. The writing itself evolved over millennia. The earliest cuneiform, from around 3,200 years before the Common Era, was quite pictographic. The symbol for sheep looked like a simple drawing of a sheep. The symbol for beer looked like a jar, but over time these pictographs became more abstract and conventionalized. By the time we get to the classical Babylonian and Assyrian cuneiform of the first millennium before the Common Era, most signs bore no resemblance to their original pictographic forms. Cuneiform was a complex script. It used hundreds of signs, and many signs could be read in multiple ways depending on context. A single sign might represent a syllable, a complete word, or a semantic category. Determinatives, special signs that weren't pronounced, were used to indicate what category a word belonged to, like whether a name referred to a god, a city, or a person. Reading cuneiform required years of training, which is why scribes were a specialized, educated elite in Mesopotamian society. The goddess Nisaba was the patron deity of scribes in Sumerian tradition, later replaced by the god Nabu in Babylonian times. Young scribes in training spent years in scribal schools called adubas, literally tablet houses. They practiced writing by copying standard texts, including lists of signs, literary classics like Gilgamesh, and mathematical tables. Thousands of these school tablets have survived, complete with the students' errors and sometimes the teachers' corrections. It's strangely moving to hold a tablet and see the mistakes of a student who lived 4,000 years ago, making them feel suddenly very human and relatable. What did these tablets tell us about the Anunnaki? They showed us that the Anunnaki appeared in a wide variety of contexts across more than 2 millennia of Mesopotamian literature. They weren't just characters in a few myths, but were woven throughout Mesopotamian religious thought. In administrative texts, we see references to offerings made to the Anunnaki. In incantations and magical texts, the Anunnaki are sometimes invoked for protection or called upon as witnesses. In hymns and prayers, they're praised as the great gods who determine fates. In wisdom literature and proverbs, their judgment is held up as the ultimate standard of justice. The electronic text. Corpus of Sumerian Literature, a project by Oxford University that has digitized and translated hundreds of Sumerian texts, shows the Anunnaki mentioned in at least 182 different lines across various texts. They appear in contexts ranging from creation myths to lamentations, from royal inscriptions to religious poetry. This comprehensive database allows scholars to study how the concept of the Anunnaki evolved and how they were understood in different periods and contexts. What becomes clear from this archaeological and textual evidence is that the Anunnaki were not peripheral figures but central to Mesopotamian religion. They represented the highest tier of divine authority, the beings who shaped the cosmos and determined the fates of gods and mortals alike. They were worshipped, feared, and invoked for more than 2,000 years, from the earliest Sumerian texts to the latest Babylonian writings. But here's what's also clear from the actual texts. The Anunnaki were never described as coming from another planet. They were never said to have arrived in spacecraft or to wear space suits. There are no ancient texts describing them mining gold or conducting genetic experiments. They were gods, supernatural beings, not aliens or ancient astronauts. This matters because, as we'll see in the next section, modern reinterpretations of the Anunnaki have strayed very far from what the ancient texts actually say. The modern reinvention, Zecharia Sitchin and the ancient astronaut theory. In 1976, a book was published that would dramatically change how many people thought about ancient Mesopotamia and the Anunnaki. The book was called The 12th Planet, and its author was Zecharia Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-born writer who had studied at the London School of Economics and worked as a journalist and editor. Sitchin made a series of extraordinary claims in his book. He argued that ancient Sumerian texts, when properly translated, revealed a completely different story than what mainstream scholars believed. According to Sitchin, the Anunnaki weren't gods at all, but extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru that had an enormous elliptical orbit around our sun, taking roughly 3,600 years to complete one revolution. When Nibiru periodically approached Earth, its inhabitants, the Anunnaki, would visit our planet. Sitchin claimed that around 450,000 years ago, the Anunnaki came to Earth in search of gold, which they needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. They initially did the mining themselves, but after growing tired of the hard labor, they genetically engineered a primitive slave species by combining their own DNA with that of Homo erectus, creating modern humans. Humanity, in Sitchin's telling, was literally bred as a workforce for alien overlords. He argued that the Anunnaki established civilization in Sumer, teaching humans agriculture, writing, mathematics, and astronomy. The great achievements of ancient Mesopotamia weren't, in his view, the product of human ingenuity, but gifts from advanced extraterrestrial visitors. Ancient texts describing the gods weren't religious mythology, but historical accounts of actual events, just using the terminology available to ancient peoples who didn't understand advanced technology. Sitchin went on to write more than a dozen books elaborating on this theory, collected in a series called The Earth Chronicles. Each book reinterpreted ancient myths and archaeological findings through the lens of ancient astronaut theory. He claimed that the Anunnaki had been involved in human history throughout ancient times, that they had bases in various parts of the world, that conflicts among the Anunnaki explained historical events, and that they might return when Nibiru next approaches Earth. The books were enormously popular. They've been translated into many languages and have sold millions of copies. Sitchin's ideas inspired countless other writers, television shows, and internet discussions. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens series, which premiered in 2009 and has aired hundreds of episodes, is heavily influenced by Sitchin's work, frequently discussing the Anunnaki as ancient astronauts. Why were Sitchin's ideas so appealing? Several factors contributed to their success. First, they tell a compelling story. The idea that ancient mysteries can be explained by advanced alien technology has obvious dramatic appeal. It transforms ancient history into science fiction, with humanity as unwitting participants in a cosmic drama. Second, the ideas tap into a sense that there's hidden knowledge, that the authorities, academic mainstream, or conventional wisdom aren't telling us the whole truth. In an age when many people distrust institutions, the idea of a lone scholar uncovering truths that the academic establishment rejects or suppresses has strong appeal. Third, Sitchin's theories seem to offer answers to genuine mysteries. How did ancient peoples build structures like the Egyptian pyramids or Stonehenge without modern technology? How did they develop sophisticated astronomical knowledge? Ancient astronaut theory provides a simple, if incorrect, explanation. They had help from aliens. Fourth, Sitchin presented his ideas with apparent scholarly rigor. He cited ancient texts, included footnotes, and claimed to be able to read Sumerian and other ancient languages. For readers without specialized knowledge of ancient Near Eastern studies, his arguments could seem convincing. However, and this is crucial, scholars who actually specialize in ancient Mesopotamia, who have spent decades studying Sumerian, Akkadian, and other cuneiform languages, have thoroughly examined Sitchin's work. Their conclusion is nearly unanimous. Sitchin's translations are wrong. His interpretations don't match what the texts actually say. Many of his central claims are simply fabrications with no basis in any ancient source. Let's look at some specific examples of where Sitchin went wrong. First, the translation of Anunnaki itself. Sitchin claimed that Anunnaki means those who from heaven came to earth. But this translation has no basis in Sumerian grammar or vocabulary. The actual meaning, as we discussed earlier, is something like offspring of An, or princely seed. It refers to their divine lineage, not to space travel. Every Sumerian scholar agrees on this. Sitchin either didn't understand Sumerian grammar or deliberately mistranslated to support his theory. Second, the planet Nibiru. In actual Mesopotamian astronomy, Nibiru was a term sometimes used for the planet Jupiter, sometimes for a fixed star, and in some contexts for a crossing point or ford. It was visible regularly, not on a 3,600-year cycle. There's absolutely no ancient text that describes Nibiru as a planet with the massive elliptical orbit Sitchin claimed. He seems to have taken the name and completely invented the astronomical scenario around it. NASA and astronomers have repeatedly pointed out that a planet with the orbit Sitchin described would be astronomically impossible. Such an orbit would be unstable. A planet swinging that close to the inner solar system every 3,600 years would cause massive gravitational disturbances that we would have observed. There's no evidence whatsoever for such a planet's existence. Third, Sitchin claimed ancient texts described the Anunnaki mining gold for use on their planet. But searches of the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature find no references to gods mining gold at all. Sitchin cited something called Bel-Nimiki, which he translated as Lord of Mining, claiming it was a title of the god Ea. But no such title exists in any Sumerian text. The actual titles for Ea emphasize his association with wisdom, fresh water, and magic, not mining. Fourth, the creation of humanity through genetic engineering. While it's true that Mesopotamian myths describe gods creating humanity from clay mixed with divine blood, this isn't a description of genetic manipulation. It's a creation myth using the conceptual framework available to Bronze Age peoples. Clay and blood were substances that made sense to them as building materials. Reading this as an account of DNA manipulation requires ignoring the entire cultural and linguistic context. Fifth, Sitchin frequently misidentified images in ancient art. He claimed certain cylinder seal images showed planetary systems or depicted spaceships. But when you look at what the images actually show and read the accompanying inscriptions, they depict standard Mesopotamian religious iconography. Gods with their traditional symbols, ritual scenes, mythological motifs. The winged disk he identified with planet Nibiru actually represents the sun god Shamash in most cases, a well-established interpretation in Assyriology. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar with a PhD in Hebrew and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, has written extensively debunking Sitchin's claims. Heiser created a website called Sitchin is Wrong, where he systematically addresses Sitchin's errors. Heiser's criticism isn't based on closed-minded rejection of new ideas, but on actual linguistic competence in the ancient languages Sitchin claimed to translate. Heiser points out that Sitchin didn't have any formal training in Sumerian, Akkadian, or any other ancient Semitic language. His degree was in economic history, not linguistics or ancient Near Eastern studies. The people who actually spend their careers studying these languages, who can read cuneiform, who publish in peer-reviewed journals on Mesopotamian texts, they all agree that Sitchin's translations are wrong. Other scholars have been equally critical. Dr. Ronald Hendel, professor of Hebrew Bible at the University of California, Berkeley, has called Sitchin's work a quintessential example of pseudo-archaeology. Dr. William Laughlin, Jr., a specialist in ancient Near Eastern languages, noted that Sitchin demonstrates a lack of understanding of Sumerian grammar and an unfortunate tendency to make up translations when they suit his purposes. The scholarly community's rejection of Sitchin isn't a conspiracy or closed-minded orthodoxy. It's based on demonstrable errors in translation, fabricated evidence, and misunderstanding of both the ancient languages and the astronomical claims. Any scholar, amateur or professional, can verify these errors by comparing Sitchin's claims to actual Sumerian texts using resources like the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature or published translations by reputable Assyriologists. It's worth noting that even within the ancient astronaut community, some researchers have distanced themselves from Sitchin's specific claims while embracing the broader idea of ancient alien contact. They recognize that his translations don't hold up, but still believe there's evidence for extraterrestrial influence in human history from other sources. The persistence of Sitchin's ideas, despite their thorough debunking, raises interesting questions about how information spreads and what people want to believe. His books continue to sell. Online forums and YouTube channels discuss the Anunnaki as ancient aliens without mentioning the scholarly consensus. New generations discover his work and assume it must have some validity because it's been published and is widely discussed. This highlights an important challenge in our information age. How do we distinguish between genuine expertise and convincing-sounding claims? How do we evaluate sources? Sitchin's work sounds scholarly if you don't have the background to evaluate it. He uses academic-seeming footnotes and discusses ancient texts. But when people with actual expertise examine his work, the errors are obvious. This isn't to say that everything academics believe is correct, or that outsiders never make valid contributions. History has examples of amateur scholars making important discoveries, but it does mean that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that evidence should be verifiable by multiple independent experts. The cultural impact and why these ideas persist. Despite being thoroughly debunked by experts, ancient astronaut theories about the Anunnaki have had enormous cultural impact. Let's explore why these ideas have proven so persistent and influential. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens television series has been enormously popular, airing over 200 episodes since 2009. The show regularly discusses the Anunnaki, presenting Sitchin's theories to millions of viewers, usually without mentioning that mainstream scholars reject these interpretations. For many viewers, this may be their primary exposure to information about ancient Mesopotamia, which means they're getting a completely inaccurate picture of what the ancient texts actually say. The show's influence extends beyond just entertainment. It has shaped how a significant portion of the public thinks about ancient history. Surveys have shown that a substantial minority of Americans believe ancient astronauts visited Earth and influenced human civilization. While not all of these believers specifically reference Sitchin or the Anunnaki, his work helped create the conceptual framework for these beliefs. The internet has amplified these ideas. YouTube is filled with videos about the Anunnaki, many presenting Sitchin's theories as fact. Online forums discuss the expected return of Nibiru, sometimes connecting it to apocalyptic prophecies. Social media allows these ideas to spread rapidly, often without the context or corrections that might appear in more traditional media. Several factors help explain why these ideas remain popular despite lacking scholarly support. First is the appeal of hidden knowledge. Ancient astronaut theories position believers as being in on a secret that mainstream authorities want to hide. This taps into a broader cultural distrust of institutions and experts. If universities and museums are wrong or lying about the Anunnaki, what else might they be wrong about? The theories appeal to a sense of being specially enlightened or awakened to truths that others can't or won't see. Second is the aesthetic appeal. Ancient astronaut theories make history seem more exciting. Who wants to learn about the development of agricultural techniques when you could learn about alien genetic experiments? The theories transform archaeology into science fiction, adding drama and cosmic significance to ancient ruins. Third is what we might call the argument from incredulity. Many people find it difficult to believe that ancient peoples could have achieved what they did without help. How could Bronze Age societies build massive pyramids or develop sophisticated astronomical knowledge? It seems easier to attribute these achievements to alien technology than to accept that our ancestors were capable of remarkable ingenuity with the tools they had. This actually sells ancient peoples short. The more we learn about ancient technology and engineering, the more impressed we should be by human achievement, not less. Ancient builders didn't need aliens. They had sophisticated mathematical knowledge, clever engineering solutions, enormous patience, and massive mobilization of human labor. Understanding how they actually achieved their accomplishments makes their achievements more impressive, not less. Fourth is the seductive appeal of simple explanations. Ancient astronaut theory provides a single explanation for many different mysteries. Pyramids in Egypt, ziggurats in Mesopotamia, Stonehenge in Britain, Machu Picchu in Peru, all built with alien help. It's neater than accepting that different cultures independently develop their own sophisticated civilizations using their own ingenuity. Fifth is what we might call science fiction literacy. We live in a culture saturated with science fiction narratives about aliens, space travel, and advanced technology. These narratives provide a ready-made conceptual framework for interpreting ancient mysteries. When someone like Sitchin tells us ancient texts are actually describing aliens and spacecraft, it feels familiar because we've encountered similar ideas in countless movies, TV shows, and novels. Sixth is the genuine fact that ancient texts can be difficult to interpret. Mesopotamian myths often describe things that are impossible or hard to visualize. Gods splitting monsters in half to create the cosmos, heroes killing nine-headed serpents, demons with multiple faces. These are strange images that don't correspond to everyday reality. When Sitchin says these texts are describing advanced technology using ancient metaphors, it can seem like a reasonable interpretation to someone without expertise in ancient literature and mythology. But here's the thing. Strange and fantastical descriptions in ancient texts don't require aliens to explain them. They require understanding mythology, as the way ancient peoples expressed ideas about the cosmos, divine power, and human existence using the conceptual tools available to them. When a Babylonian text describes Marduk splitting Tiamat's body to create heaven and earth, that's not a garbled description of planetary formation observed by ancient astronauts. It's a powerful mythological metaphor for the establishment of cosmic order from primordial chaos, expressed in violent, dramatic imagery that would have resonated with the Babylonians' own experiences of kingship and warfare. Understanding this requires what scholars call cultural literacy, the ability to interpret texts within their proper historical, linguistic, and cultural context. It's a skill that takes training and practice. Without it, it's easy to misinterpret ancient texts, reading modern concepts back into them. There's also a broader issue about what we might call the politics of knowledge. Who gets to say what ancient texts mean? Who has authority to interpret the past? Mainstream archaeology and linguistics base their authority on systematic methods, peer review, and accumulated expertise. But for people who distrust institutions or who feel excluded from traditional academic knowledge production, this authority can seem illegitimate. Sitchin and other alternative historians position themselves as outsiders, challenging an entrenched establishment. This is appealing to many people. It suggests that you don't need a PhD to understand history, that common sense and open-mindedness might be more valuable than formal training. While there's something democratic and appealing about this idea, it ignores the very real value of expertise and training. Learning ancient languages is hard. Understanding the cultural contexts of 3,000-year-old civilizations requires extensive study. The methods archaeologists use to date artifacts, interpret stratigraphy, and reconstruct ancient societies are sophisticated and rigorous. Dismissing all of this expertise in favor of alternative interpretations that sound exciting but have no scholarly support isn't being open-minded, it's being credulous. None of this is meant to suggest that mainstream archaeology has all the answers. Scholarly consensus changes as new evidence emerges. Interpretations that were widely accepted can be overturned by new discoveries. Genuine debate exists about many aspects of ancient Mesopotamian society and religion. But these debates happen within a framework of rigorous methodology and verifiable evidence. They don't involve claiming ancient texts say things they demonstrably don't say. The persistence of ancient astronaut theories about the Anunnaki tells us something interesting about our own culture. We're fascinated by the past, but often don't want to do the hard work of understanding it on its own terms. We want ancient wisdom, but presented in ways that fit our modern sensibilities. We want the exotic mystery of ancient civilizations, but explained through the familiar lens of science fiction. We want to feel that there's more to reality than what we can see, that there are grand cosmic dramas in which humanity plays a part. These are understandable desires. The human fascination with mystery, with the possibility of other intelligences in the universe, with uncovering hidden truths, these are not bad impulses. But they need to be coupled with rigorous thinking and respect for evidence. The real history of ancient Mesopotamia, understood properly, is actually more fascinating than Sitchin's inventions. It just requires more effort to understand. What we actually know about the Anunnaki. So let's return to solid ground and summarize what we actually know about the Anunnaki based on verifiable historical evidence and scholarly consensus. The Anunnaki were deities in ancient Mesopotamian religion, worshipped by the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians over a period of more than 2,000 years. The term Anunnaki means something like offspring of An, or princely seed, referring to their descent from An, the supreme sky god, and their status as divine nobility. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki seem to have been a collective term for the great gods, the highest tier of the divine hierarchy. They were the beings who determined fates, who made cosmic decisions, who established the fundamental order of reality. They weren't a fixed group, but rather a category, though certain major deities like Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, and others were consistently counted among them. As Mesopotamian religion evolved, the understanding of the Anunnaki changed. By the first millennium before the Common Era, in Babylonian and Assyrian texts, the Anunnaki had become more closely associated with the underworld, serving as judges of the dead. This shift reflects the introduction of the Igigi as a separate group of divine beings and broader changes in Mesopotamian cosmology. The Anunnaki appear in all the major works of Mesopotamian literature we've discussed. The Epic of Gilgamesh, where they're the 7 judges wielding torches during the flood. The Enuma Elish, where they acknowledge Marduk's supremacy and build his temple. The Atrahasis epic, where they originally forced the Igigi to do hard labor before humanity is created to take over that role, and in numerous hymns, prayers, incantations, and other religious texts. Archaeological evidence shows that while individual Anunnaki gods like Enlil and Enki had their own temples and cult centers, the Anunnaki as a collective group weren't typically worshipped separately. Instead, they represented a theological concept, the divine council that governed the cosmos. In art and iconography, Anunnaki gods were depicted wearing the traditional markers of divinity, horned crowns, often with multiple tiers of horns to indicate their high status. They wore elaborate robes with intricate decorations. They were shown larger than human figures and often surrounded by various symbols associated with their particular domains and powers. What we don't find in any authentic ancient texts is any description of the Anunnaki as coming from another planet, any mention of spacecraft, spacesuits, or advanced technology, any reference to the Anunnaki mining gold for any purpose, any account of genetic engineering or mixing alien DNA with earthly primates, any planet Nibiru with a 3,600-year orbit, any prediction of the Anunnaki returning when Nibiru approaches Earth. These are all modern inventions, primarily by Zecharia Sitchin, with no basis in actual Mesopotamian texts. What we do find is a sophisticated religious and mythological system in which the Anunnaki played a crucial role in how ancient Mesopotamians understood the cosmos and their place in it. These texts reveal a civilization grappling with fundamental questions. Why do we exist? What is our relationship to divine power? How did the world come to be? What happens after we die? Why do the innocent suffer and the wicked sometimes prosper? The answers Mesopotamian texts provide to these questions may not satisfy modern sensibilities, but they made sense within their cultural context. Humans were created to serve the gods through offerings and temple maintenance. The gods could be capricious, driven by their own emotions and conflicts. Fate was determined by divine counsel with no guarantee of fairness. Mortality was humanity's unavoidable lot, with only the very rarest exceptions. These beliefs shaped a civilization, They justified the social hierarchy, with kings claiming divine authority and priests holding special access to the gods. They explained why natural disasters struck and provided rituals to try to prevent them. They gave meaning to suffering and provided hope that proper worship and behavior might win divine favor. Understanding the Anunnaki in their proper historical context reveals not evidence of ancient aliens, but something arguably more valuable: insight into how one of humanity's earliest civilizations thought about fundamental questions of existence. It shows us that humans thousands of years ago were just as capable of complex thought, sophisticated storytelling, and profound philosophy as we are today, even though their conceptual frameworks were different from ours. Ongoing archaeological work continues to refine our understanding. Tablets are still being excavated, translated, and published. As more texts become available and as scholars continue to study the languages and culture of ancient Mesopotamia, our picture of Anunnaki religion becomes more detailed and nuanced. Recent years have seen increased interest in Mesopotamian studies, partly driven by tragic circumstances. The wars and conflicts in Iraq and Syria have threatened or destroyed some archaeological sites, creating urgency around documenting and protecting cultural heritage. At the same time, these conflicts have occasionally exposed new sites or brought previously unknown tablets to light, albeit often through looting, which destroys their archaeological context. Digital humanities projects like the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature are making ancient texts more accessible than ever before. Scholars can now search across thousands of texts instantly, identifying patterns and connections that would have taken years to find in the past. This is leading to new insights about how religious concepts evolved and how different texts relate to each other. There's also growing appreciation for the sophistication of Mesopotamian science and technology. Their mathematics was remarkably advanced, using a base 60 system that allowed them to work with fractions much more easily than our base 10 system does. Their astronomical observations were precise enough to predict eclipses and track planetary movements. Their legal codes, like Hammurabi's famous law code, show complex thinking about justice, property rights, and social organization. Their medical texts demonstrate systematic observation of symptoms and treatments. None of this required alien intervention. It was human achievement, the product of countless individuals over many generations building on each other's work, making small improvements and innovations that accumulated into impressive civilizations. Understanding this makes the Mesopotamian achievement more impressive, not less. The Anunnaki were central to how these people understood their world. Whether we view them as metaphors, as cultural artifacts, as expressions of psychological archetypes, or simply as the gods of a dead religion, they're worth understanding accurately. They represent a crucial chapter in human religious thought, connecting the shamanic traditions of Neolithic peoples to the more complex theological systems of classical antiquity and beyond. Conclusion: separating fact from fascinating fiction. As our journey through the world of the Anunnaki comes to a close, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've discovered. We've traveled from the genuine mysteries of ancient Sumer to the modern myths created by ancient astronaut theorists. We've examined both the real history preserved in cuneiform tablets and the fictional reinterpretations that have captured popular imagination. The true story of the Anunnaki is itself remarkable. These deities were central to how one of humanity's first great civilizations understood the cosmos and their place within it. For more than 2 millennia, people living in the cities of Mesopotamia offered prayers and sacrifices to these gods, built temples in their honor, and shaped their entire society around beliefs involving the Anunnaki. The literature of ancient Mesopotamia, containing stories of these gods, represents some of humanity's earliest written narratives. The Epic of Gilgamesh explores themes of friendship, mortality, and the human condition with a sophistication that still resonates today. The Enuma Elish offers a creation myth of cosmic scope and dramatic power. The flood narrative in these texts provided inspiration for later religious traditions. The archaeological recovery of this civilization is itself an extraordinary achievement. Scholars managed to decipher a script that had been forgotten for 2,000 years, unlocking a vast library of texts that revolutionized our understanding of ancient history. This work continues today, with new texts being translated and new insights emerging about this fascinating culture. The modern reinterpretation of the Anunnaki as ancient astronauts is, from a scholarly standpoint, demonstrably wrong. The translations that support this interpretation are inaccurate. The astronomical claims are impossible. The evidence cited either doesn't exist or doesn't mean what ancient astronaut theorists claim it means. Yet we can understand why these ideas have proven popular. They tap into genuine human desires, to find hidden meaning in the past, to believe in forces greater than ourselves, to feel that reality is stranger and more exciting than it appears. The problem isn't the desire for wonder and mystery. The problem is when that desire leads us to abandon critical thinking and embrace claims that don't hold up to scrutiny. The real history of ancient Mesopotamia is actually more fascinating than Sitchin's inventions, not because it involves aliens, but because it reveals the genuine creativity and ingenuity of ancient peoples. When we understand that the Sumerians invented writing, developed sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, and created complex urban civilizations entirely through human effort, it's more impressive than attributing it all to extraterrestrial teachers. When we read the Epic of Gilgamesh as a profound meditation on mortality rather than as a garbled account of alien genetic engineering, it speaks more powerfully to the human condition. When we understand Mesopotamian creation myths as sophisticated theological and philosophical statements rather than primitive confusion about planetary formation, we gain real insight into how ancient peoples thought. The lesson here extends beyond just the Anunnaki. In our information-rich age, we're constantly confronted with claims that sound plausible, that are presented with apparent authority, but that may not actually be supported by solid evidence. Learning to evaluate sources, to distinguish expertise from pseudo-expertise, to ask for verifiable evidence, these are crucial skills. This doesn't mean we should never question consensus or that outsiders never make valid contributions to knowledge. It means we should demand that extraordinary claims be supported by extraordinary evidence, that translations of ancient texts should be verifiable by multiple experts in the relevant languages, and that theories should make predictions that can be tested. The genuine mysteries of the ancient world, the questions we still can't answer about how societies developed, why civilizations rose and fell, what ancient peoples believed and experienced. These are worth investigating with rigor and care. The Anunnaki, understood properly, are a window into how one of humanity's earliest civilizations thought about the divine, about creation, about humanity's place in the cosmos. As we close, remember that history is not a dusty collection of facts about dead people and extinct civilizations. History is the story of us, of humanity's long journey from the first tentative steps toward civilization to the complex global society we inhabit today. Every ancient text deciphered, every archaeological site excavated, every piece of the past we recover helps us understand that journey better. The Sumerians who first pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets, creating the earliest writing, were our ancestors, not in a genetic sense necessarily, but in a cultural one. They gave us writing, mathematics, literature, urban planning, complex government, and so much more. Their gods, including the mysterious Anunnaki, were part of how they made sense of a challenging world, how they found meaning and purpose in existence. We may no longer worship these gods, but we can appreciate the role they played in human cultural evolution. We can marvel at the sophistication of the myths that were told about them. We can be amazed by the persistence of these stories, preserved in clay for millennia until modern scholars could bring them back to life. If you've found this journey through ancient Mesopotamia and the world of the Anunnaki fascinating, I encourage you to explore further. Read the Epic of Gilgamesh in a good modern translation. Look into the work of reputable scholars who study ancient Mesopotamia. Visit museums that house Mesopotamian artifacts if you can. Learn about the ongoing work of archaeologists and linguists who continue to expand our knowledge of this crucial period in human history. Be curious, ask questions, seek out reliable sources. Don't be satisfied with simple answers to complex questions. The real world, properly understood, is far more fascinating than any fiction. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Anunnaki and ancient Mesopotamia, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more historical deep dives. Share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of ancient Mesopotamian civilization would you like to learn more about? What other historical mysteries shall we explore together? Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that the past is not as distant as it seems. In every word we write, every city we build, every question we ask about our place in the universe, we're continuing a conversation that began thousands of years ago on the banks of two rivers in ancient Mesopotamia. Good night, and thank you for listening.